Judge David Harris has spent his life upholding justice, until one night a routine traffic stop shatters his world. Pulled over by an officer who questions his identity and treats him as a suspect, David is forced to confront the very injustice he's fought against. What starts as personal humiliation sparks a national movement for police reform, with David at the center. Will he succeed in changing the system, or will the fight tear his community and family apart? Stay tuned to find out. Subscribe for more powerful stories and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in David's shoes? Now let's dive in. The soft hum of conversation filled the banquet hall as Judge David Harris stood on the small stage, glancing out over the audience gathered in his honor. The room was full of familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and members of the local community, each of them a witness to the journey that had brought him to this moment. Tonight, he was being recognized for his years of service to the community and his commitment to justice. For David, the award was more than just an acknowledgement of his hard work. It was a testament to the values he had built his life around. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Ava, his wife of 12 years, who stood beaming proudly from the front row. Beside her sat their 2 children, Jordan and Lila, who waved at him excitedly. A smile tugged at the corner of David's lips as he returned the wave, feeling a rare sense of contentment settle over him. These moments of peace had been few and far between lately, with work often consuming most of his time and energy. But tonight, surrounded by people who mattered most, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. David turned his attention back to the podium and cleared his throat. The room fell silent, and the weight of the evening pressed down on him, though not uncomfortably. Public speaking had never been an issue for David. In fact, he found a strange sense of calm in it, especially when addressing topics he was passionate about. And tonight, he was speaking about one of those topics: justice. "Thank you all for being here," David began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "It's an honor to stand before you tonight, not because of this award, but because of what it represents. Justice isn't just a word we toss around in courtrooms or in legal discussions. It's a principle that should guide every aspect of our lives. It's about fairness, equality, and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, is treated with dignity and respect." There were nods of agreement throughout the room, and David continued, feeling the energy shift as the audience leaned in, listening closely. "I've spent my career fighting for that kind of justice, not just for the people who come into my courtroom, but for those who don't always have a voice. We live in a system that often favors the powerful, the wealthy, the privileged, but real justice means standing up for the underrepresented, the marginalized, and those who have been silenced." He paused, letting his words sink in. This was more than just a speech for him. It reflected his life's work. He had always believed in the importance of fairness, but he had also seen firsthand how the justice system could fail the very people it was meant to protect. "I'm proud of the work we've done," David said, his gaze sweeping the room. "But I also know there's so much more to be done. Tonight isn't just about celebrating the past, it's about looking forward. It's about the future we're all working toward. And I believe that together we can build a more just and equitable society for everyone." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, echoing off the walls of the banquet hall. David smiled, stepping back from the podium as he nodded appreciatively to the crowd. The warmth and support from the community meant the world to him, but as the applause continued, David couldn't shake the feeling that his work wasn't finished. In truth, it never would be. Justice, real justice, was an ongoing fight. A fight that required constant vigilance, dedication, and resilience. After the formalities of the ceremony ended, David mingled with the attendees. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and listened as people expressed their admiration for his work. He appreciated the kind words, but more than anything, he cherished the connections he was able to make with people whose lives had been touched by his efforts. As the evening wore on, David felt the weight of the long day beginning to settle in his bones. He glanced across the room and caught Eva's eye. She smiled warmly at him, and in that moment, David knew it was time to head home. It had been a good night, and now all he wanted was to relax and enjoy a quiet evening with his family. Earlier that evening, before the award ceremony, David had attended a different kind of event, one that was just as meaningful, if not more so. The community center downtown had hosted a fundraiser for underprivileged youth, a cause that was near and dear to David's heart. The event was filled with energy and optimism, and David had been invited to speak to a group of young people about perseverance, opportunity, and, of course, justice. Standing in the modest but lively community center, David had felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had grown up in this very town, not too far from where the center stood now. He had been one of those kids, once upon a time, looking for guidance, for hope, for someone to show him that there was a path forward, no matter how difficult life seemed. As David took the stage at the fundraiser, the room quieted, and dozens of eager eyes turned toward him. Many of the young faces in the audience reminded him of himself at their age. Bright, hopeful, but also uncertain about the future. "Good evening, everyone," David had begun, his voice calm and reassuring. "I want to thank you for having me here tonight. It's an honor to be with you, especially for a cause as important as this one. I know firsthand how challenging life can be when you don't have the resources or support you need. But I also know that with perseverance and a little bit of help, anything is possible." He had paused for a moment, scanning the room and making eye contact with a few of the young people seated in the front row. "When I was your age, I didn't have much. My parents worked hard, but we struggled. There were times when I wasn't sure if I'd ever make it out of the situation I was in. But I had people who believed in me, people who pushed me to dream bigger, to work harder, to never give up." David could see the impact his words were having on the audience. The teenagers were listening intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hope. "And I'm here to tell you that no matter what challenges you face, no matter what obstacles are in your way, you can succeed. You can achieve great things, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to take hard work, dedication, and the willingness to push through when things get tough. But I believe in you, and I know you have the potential to change the world." The applause that followed had been loud and heartfelt, and David had stepped down from the stage feeling a deep sense of connection with the audience. After his speech, he had spent time talking with some of the attendees, listening to their stories and offering words of encouragement. One person in particular stood out to David, a young woman named Rachel Matthews, who had recently become one of the most vocal activists in the community. She was passionate, driven, and fiercely dedicated to fighting for justice, especially when it came to police reform. "Judge Harris," Rachel had said, approaching him after the event, "I just wanted to thank you for your work. You've been an inspiration to so many of us, especially those of us fighting for reform in the community." David had smiled warmly at her. "Thank you, Rachel. I'm just trying to do my part, but I appreciate the support." Rachel had nodded, her expression serious. "We're doing everything we can to push for real change, but it's tough. People don't always want to listen, and sometimes it feels like we're not making any progress." David had placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Change takes time, but it's people like you who make the difference. Keep pushing. Keep speaking up. You're making more of an impact than you know." Rachel had smiled, clearly grateful for his words. "I won't stop, Judge, and I know you won't either." The evening was winding down, and David finally made his way to the parking lot, his mind still buzzing from the events of the night. The warm glow of streetlights illuminated the nearly empty streets, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was late, well past 11 p.m., and most of the town had already retreated into the comfort of their homes. David climbed into his car, loosening his tie as he sank into the driver's seat. He let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of the day's events settle over him. But it was a good kind of weight, a sense of accomplishment mixed with a deep appreciation for the work he had done and the people he had touched. Turning the key in the ignition, David let the engine hum softly as he took a moment to collect his thoughts. The drive home would only take about 15 minutes, and the quiet of the late night was a welcome respite from the constant bustle of his day-to-day life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his mind wandered to his family. Ava and the kids were probably asleep by now, but he couldn't wait to see them. The thought of kissing his children goodnight, even if they were already in bed, brought a smile to his face. Jordan had been excited about the award ceremony, proudly telling his classmates that his dad was a super important judge, and Lila, though younger, had been just as eager to see him walk across the stage. The quiet of the night wrapped around him like a comforting blanket as he drove through the empty streets. It was a rare moment of peace, a chance to unwind and reflect. David thought about his speech, about the fundraiser, and about the conversations he had had with the people who had approached him after the event. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but tonight had reminded him of how far he had come, and how much further there was to go. He reached for the radio, his fingers hovering over the dial, when the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror made his heart skip a beat. The smile that had been on his face faded instantly, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. David's eyes darted to the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. In fact, he had been driving well within the limit. His car was in perfect working order, and there was no reason he should have been pulled over. Yet, the flashing lights persisted, demanding his attention. David's mind raced, but he quickly calmed himself, taking a deep breath. He had done nothing wrong. This was probably just a routine stop. Maybe they were checking for something unrelated to him. Still, experience had taught him that encounters like these could be unpredictable, especially for someone like him, a black man driving alone at night. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the anxiety in his chest growing stronger. His thoughts churned as he mentally prepared himself for what might come next. He knew the drill all too well. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, answer the officer's questions politely, and, most importantly, don't make any sudden movements. David reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license and his judicial identification card. He had learned from countless stories that it was better to have everything ready, to minimize the chances of any misunderstandings. As he waited, the flashing lights cast long shadows across the empty road, and David could feel his pulse quicken. He kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, taking slow, measured breaths as he watched the officer step out of the patrol car and approach his vehicle. Through the rearview mirror, David saw the officer's silhouette moving toward his car. The man was tall, broad-shouldered and white, his dark uniform blending into the night. His face was set in a deep frown, and his eyes narrowed as he neared the driver's side window, already projecting an air of suspicion. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. This was nothing new. He had been in similar situations before, and he knew how to handle it. Just stay composed. The officer knocked on the window, and David rolled it down smoothly, the cool night air brushing against his face. "Evening, officer," David greeted, keeping his tone polite and neutral. "Is there a problem?" The officer, whose name tag read Daniels, peered into the car, his gaze sweeping over the interior with quick, practiced glances. He barely acknowledged David's greeting before cutting straight to the point. "License and registration," Daniels said, his tone blunt and unyielding. David handed over his documents without hesitation, including his judicial ID. "Here's my license, registration, and my identification. I'm Judge David Harris," he said, hoping that the ID would diffuse the situation. But Daniels barely glanced at the documents. Instead, his eyes lingered on David for a moment, his expression hard and unreadable. There was a beat of silence before the officer finally spoke again. "You're a judge?" Daniels asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," David replied, keeping his tone steady. He had learned long ago not to let skepticism like this get under his skin, though it was a challenge every time. Daniels flipped through the documents, his face betraying no change in expression. There was a slight pause when he saw the judicial ID, but he quickly moved past it, handing the papers back with the same bluntness as before. "Where are you headed tonight, Judge?" Daniels asked, though the title sounded more like a mockery than a sign of respect. "I'm headed home," David said evenly. "I just left a community event downtown." Daniels leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read something more into David's words. A community event, huh? He repeated, his voice laced with doubt. Do you mind stepping out of the car for a minute? David blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. This wasn't what he had expected. A routine stops typically ended with a brief explanation, or, at worst, a minor citation, not a request to step out of the vehicle. But he knew better than to argue. Complying, even with unreasonable demands, was often the safest course of action in situations like this. Of course, David said, though a faint unease settled in the pit of his stomach. David opened the door carefully, stepping out of the car with slow, deliberate movements, his hands visible at all times. He knew the importance of not making any sudden gestures. The last thing he wanted was for this encounter to take a dangerous turn. Officer Daniels stepped back, watching David closely as he exited the vehicle. There was a coldness to Daniels' demeanor, a tension that made the hair on the back of David's neck stand on end. Daniels' hand rested lightly on the holster of his weapon, a gesture that wasn't lost on David. It was a subtle move, but one that spoke volumes. The officer motioned for David to move to the front of the car. "Stand right here," Daniels ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. David complied, stepping into the harsh glow of the headlights, feeling strangely exposed as the bright light illuminated him. He stood with his hands at his sides, careful not to make any movement that could be misinterpreted. His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to let his frustration or fear show. "What's this all about, officer?" David asked, his voice calm, though the tension was starting to seep into his bones. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a suspect. Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step back, eyeing David with the same suspicion he had shown from the start. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, Daniels spoke, his tone cold and dismissive. "You sure that ID is real?" David felt a flash of frustration, but he quickly tamped it down. "It's real. I've been a judge in this county for nearly 10 years. Daniels stared at him, his eyes narrowing even further. "You don't really look like a judge," he said, his words heavy with unspoken meaning. David met Daniels' gaze, refusing to flinch. He had heard comments like this before. Comments laced with skepticism and doubt. Comments that questioned his right to hold the position he did. It wasn't just about his title. It was about who he was, what he looked like. The officer's disbelief wasn't rooted in legality. It was rooted in something far deeper, something more insidious. "I don't know what a judge is supposed to look like," David said, his voice steady, "but I've been one for nearly a decade, and I take my job seriously." Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step back, eyeing David as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. There was a long, uncomfortable pause before the officer finally spoke again. "Where exactly are you coming from, Judge?" Daniels asked, though the word judge still carried that same mocking tone. "I told you," David replied, trying to keep the conversation as straightforward as possible. "I just left a community event downtown." Daniels frowned, clearly not satisfied with the answer. "A community event," he repeated, his voice dripping with doubt. "And you just happened to be driving this car?" David blinked, caught off guard by the insinuation. "Yes, officer." "Is there something wrong with that?" Daniels didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer, his hand still resting on the holster of his weapon. The tension in the air thickened, and David could feel the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the encounter, turning what should have been a simple stop into something far more troubling. The officer's suspicion wasn't about legality anymore. It was about perception, about who belonged in positions of power and who didn't. David knew this kind of encounter all too well. He had seen it play out in the lives of others, heard it in testimony after testimony from defendants who had found themselves in similar situations. And now it was happening to him. The night air felt colder as David stood beside his car, bathed in the harsh glow of the headlights. His heartbeat, though steady, had quickened as the encounter stretched on. Daniel's scrutiny, combined with the silence that hung between them, had turned what should have been a brief interaction into something far more dangerous. David remained calm, his hands visible at all times, though his patience was wearing thin. He knew better than to escalate the situation, but the growing frustration gnawed at him. Finally, Daniel stepped back and motioned toward the car. "Mind if I take a look inside?" David hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Is that really necessary, officer? I've given you my license and identification. I've told you where I'm coming from and where I'm headed. What more do you need?" Daniel's eyes flickered with something, annoyance, perhaps, or a sense of entitlement. "I need to be sure, Judge," he replied coldly. "People say a lot of things, but that doesn't mean they're telling the truth." David clenched his teeth, the tension in his gut tightening. But he knew that refusing the officer's request could lead to an even more dangerous situation. He had seen how quickly suspicion could turn into an accusation, how easily things could spiral out of control. "Go ahead," David said finally, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. Daniels gave a curt nod and stepped toward the car, his hands moving methodically as he opened the door and began searching through the interior. David watched as the officer rifled through his briefcase, papers, and coat with unnecessary roughness. After several long minutes, Daniels closed the car door, clearly unsatisfied. He turned back to David, his frown deepening. "Everything seems to check out," Daniels muttered, though his tone didn't soften. It was clear he was still grappling with the idea that the man he had stopped wasn't who he had assumed him to be. David didn't respond. He stood silently, waiting for the officer to make his next move, though every muscle in his body was tense. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, scrutinized, doubted, and treated as though he didn't belong. Daniels took a step closer, his gaze hard. "You say you're a judge," he said slowly, as if the words themselves were difficult to believe. "But you sure don't seem like one." David met the officer's gaze, refusing to back down. He had heard these kinds of comments before. Comments that challenged his very right to exist in a position of authority. Comments that questioned his legitimacy, not based on his qualifications, but on something far more insidious. "I've been a judge for nearly 10 years, David said calmly, though his voice carried an edge of steel. "And I've handled cases far more complicated than this interaction." Daniels smirked, though the expression was chilling in its dismissiveness. "A judge, huh? Sure, doesn't seem like it." The weight of the accusation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. For the first time that night, David felt a sharp pang of anger rise in his chest. It was one thing to be cautious, to follow procedure, but this officer wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind about who David was, and no amount of explanation or evidence was going to change that. David took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him. Not here. Not now. "I'm going to run these through the system," Daniels said, holding up David's documents. "You stay right here." As the officer walked back to his cruiser, David stood by his car, his hands resting calmly at his sides. Though every muscle in his body was taut with frustration, he knew this was more than just a traffic stop. This was about power, about control, and about the assumptions the officer had made the moment he saw a black man behind the wheel of an expensive car late at night. The police cruiser's lights flashed ominously, casting long shadows across the pavement. David glanced around, aware of the small crowd gathering just a block away. A couple of bystanders had pulled out their phones, recording the encounter from a distance. David sighed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, for equality, for the very principles that seemed so far removed from this moment. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of a dark street, subjected to the same kind of treatment he had fought against for so long. As the minutes dragged on, David realized that this was no longer just about getting home. This was about something far bigger, about a system that was rigged against people like him, a system that treated him as guilty before proven innocent. David stood tall, his heart steady but his resolve hardened. He had been tested before, and he had always come out stronger. Tonight would be no different. The sky had darkened to an inky black by the time Officer Daniels returned from his patrol car, holding David's documents. David had remained by his vehicle, trying to keep calm as the minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. He knew the officer was stalling, searching for any reason to escalate the situation further. Daniels walked up to him, his face impassive as he handed David his license and ID back. "Looks like everything checks out," the officer muttered, though his tone carried no hint of an apology. David took the documents, his jaw tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but he knew better. He knew that pushing back would only make things worse. Instead, he slipped his wallet back into his pocket and nodded. "Am I free to go now, officer?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Daniels didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped back, eyes sweeping over David one last time before he nodded. "You can go." David didn't move right away. He stood there for a moment, staring at the officer, wondering if he had truly been released or if this was some kind of trap. But then Daniels turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word, the flashing lights still painting the street in harsh red and blue. David climbed back into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through him as he started the engine. The night's silence returned, but the unease that had settled over him refused to fade. He drove the rest of the way home in a daze, the events of the past hour playing over and over in his mind. The way Daniels had treated him, the suspicion, the doubt, the disbelief. It gnawed at him like a persistent itch. He had experienced discrimination before, but something about this encounter had struck deeper than usual. Perhaps it was because he had done everything right, had complied without resistance, and still it hadn't been enough. As he pulled into his driveway, the lights of his house glowing warmly in the distance, David let out a long, weary breath. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house where his family slept peacefully inside. This was supposed to be the end of a perfect evening, a celebration of his work and his values. But instead, it had ended in humiliation and frustration. David closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the exhaustion to wash over him. Then he stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Inside, everything was quiet. Ava had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Went to bed early. See you in the morning. Love you." David smiled faintly, feeling a pang of relief as he read her words. But even the warmth of his home and the love of his family couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom quietly, not wanting to wake Eva, and slipped into bed beside her. As he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his mind raced with thoughts of the night. He had always known the system was flawed. He had seen it with his own eyes, heard it in the stories of the people who came into his courtroom. But tonight had made that reality feel all the more personal, all the more urgent. The knot of frustration in his chest tightened. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. The next morning, David woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The warm sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden light across the room. Ava was already up, her side of the bed neatly made, and the faint clatter of dishes from downstairs told him she was probably in the kitchen, making breakfast for the kids. David sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as the events of the previous night came rushing back. He glanced at his phone, which was sitting on the nightstand, and noticed a notification. Viral video. Judge David Harris detained in late-night traffic stop. His stomach dropped as he opened the message. The video had already begun circulating on social media. A grainy clip taken by one of the bystanders from the sidewalk. It showed him standing beside his car, under the harsh glare of the police cruiser's headlights, with Officer Daniels searching his vehicle. The caption on the video read, "Racial profiling or routine stop. Judge David Harris detained by local police." David watched the video in silence, his heart pounding. This was it. His private humiliation was now public. The comments beneath the post were a mix of outrage and disbelief, with many people questioning why the stop had escalated the way it did. Others were quick to defend the officer, claiming it was standard procedure. David set his phone down with a sigh and headed downstairs. The smell of bacon and pancakes greeted him as he stepped into the kitchen. Eva was at the stove, flipping pancakes while the kids sat at the table. their attention focused on a Saturday morning cartoon playing on the TV. "Morning?" David greeted, his voice a little hoarse. Ava turned to him with a smile. "Morning? How was the rest of your night?" "I'm sorry I went to bed early. I was exhausted." David forced a smile. "It was fine," he said, though the memory of the traffic stop still weighed heavily on him. Ava studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Are you okay? You seem off?" David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned against the counter. "Something happened last night on the way home." Ava set the spatula down, turning to face him fully. "What happened?" David hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the details, but he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. "I got pulled over by the police," he began, his voice steady but filled with the frustration he had been trying to suppress. "Officer didn't believe I was a judge. He made me get out of the car and searched it. Treated me like I didn't belong." Ava's eyes widened with disbelief. "What? David, that's—" She paused, shaking her head as if trying to process what he had just said. "Why didn't you tell me last night?" "I didn't want to wake you," David replied, his voice softening. "And I wasn't sure how to explain it. It all happened so fast." Ava stepped closer, her expression softening as she reached for his hand. "I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened to you." David shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not about me, Ava. It's about the fact that this keeps happening. I did everything right. I complied. I showed him my ID, told him who I was, and still, it wasn't enough." Ava squeezed his hand, her voice filled with quiet anger. "What are you going to do?" David took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. "I don't know yet. But I'm not going to let this go. I can't." By the time David arrived at his office later that morning, the viral video had gained even more traction. News outlets had picked up the story, and journalists were already calling, asking for a statement. David knew he couldn't stay silent, not with so many people watching. But what could he say? How could he explain the weight of the encounter, the way it had left him feeling powerless and frustrated, without sounding like he was just another victim of the system he had spent his life working within? David sat at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. The words refused to come. He had given hundreds of speeches in his career, but this was different. This was personal. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Marcus Jacobs, one of his oldest friends and a fellow judge. Marcus had been a mentor to David throughout his career, always offering advice and guidance when things got tough. "David, I saw the video. We need to talk." David sighed, picking up the phone to call Marcus. He knew that if anyone could help him make sense of this, it was Marcus. "David," Marcus answered after the first ring, his voice heavy with concern. "I saw the video. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," David replied, though his voice betrayed the tension he was feeling. "But it's been a long night." "I can imagine," Marcus said, his tone serious. "Listen, I don't want to beat around the bush. This video is blowing up, and people are talking. You can't stay quiet on this." David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but I don't know what to say, Marcus. I don't want to make this about me." "It's not just about you," Marcus said firmly. "This is about the bigger picture. What happened to you is happening to people all over the country, and you know that better than anyone. You have a platform, David. People are going to listen to you. You need to speak up." David was silent for a moment, letting Marcus's words sink in. He knew his friend was right. He couldn't stay silent. If he did, he would be turning his back on everything he had fought for throughout his career. "I'll make a statement," David said finally, his voice resolute. "But I'm going to do it on my terms. This isn't just about one bad cop or one bad night. This is about a system that's broken, and I'm going to make sure people understand that." The press conference was scheduled for later that afternoon. David hadn't expected the response to be so immediate, but the media frenzy surrounding the video had made it impossible to ignore. Reporters had gathered outside his office, cameras flashing as they waited for him to make his statement. David stood in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his tie as he prepared to face the crowd. His reflection stared back at him, and for a moment he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had spent years building a reputation as a fair and just judge, But now he was being thrust into the spotlight in a way he had never anticipated. There was a knock at the door, and David turned to see Rachel Matthews standing in the doorway. She had heard about the press conference and had come to offer her support. "Judge Harris," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady, "I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you for speaking out. I know this can't be easy, but we need people like you to lead the way." David smiled at her, grateful for the encouragement. "Thank you, Rachel. It's not easy, but you're right. This needs to be said." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "People are listening, Judge. This is bigger than just one encounter. It's about all of us." David took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and now it was time to take that fight to the next level. As he stepped out of his office and into the bright sunlight, the cameras clicked, and the reporters swarmed around him, their microphones thrust toward his face. David raised a hand, signaling for silence as he prepared to make his statement. "I want to start by saying that what happened to me last night was not an isolated incident," David began, his voice strong and clear. "I was stopped, detained, and searched by a police officer who questioned my right to be in the position I hold. This kind of treatment is something that happens far too often in this country, and it's not just happening to me. It's happening to people of color across this nation every day." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, for fairness, and for equality under the law. But last night, I was reminded that we still have a long way to go. The system we trust to protect us is failing too many people, and it's time for that to change." The reporters listened intently, their pens scribbling furiously as David continued. "This isn't about one officer or one traffic stop. This is about a system that needs reform. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their race or background, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. I'm calling for a full investigation into this incident. And I'm calling for broader reforms to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." When David finished, the crowd erupted with questions, but he waved them off, stepping back from the podium. He had said what he needed to say. Now it was time to see what came next. David's statement made headlines almost immediately. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and within hours, his name was trending on social media. The video of his traffic stop was being replayed on every major news channel, accompanied by discussions about racial profiling, police reform, and the need for systemic change. Public reactions were mixed. Many people rallied behind David, calling him a hero for speaking out and using his platform to highlight the ongoing issue of racial injustice. Activists across the country reached out, offering their support and solidarity. But there were also voices of dissent, people who accused David of overreacting, of making a mountain out of a molehill. Some argued that Officer Daniels had simply been doing his job, that there was no need to politicize the incident. David tried to tune out the noise, but it wasn't easy. Every time he turned on the TV or checked his phone, there was another headline, another comment, another opinion. The weight of it all felt overwhelming at times, but he knew that staying silent wasn't an option. Eva was his rock through it all. She stood by his side, offering support and encouragement as he navigated the storm of public attention. But even she couldn't shield him from the hate mail, the threats, the whispers from people who didn't believe his story or didn't want to hear it. One night, as they sat on the couch together, Eva turned to him, her brow furrowed with concern. "David, are you sure you're okay? This is a lot to deal with." David sighed, leaning his head back against the couch. "I'm okay. It's just exhausting. I knew there would be backlash, but I didn't expect it to be this intense." Eva reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're doing the right thing. Don't forget that. You're making a difference." David smiled faintly, though the exhaustion still weighed on him. "I know. I just hope it's enough." As the public debate raged on, David's call for an investigation into Officer Daniels' actions was met with mixed responses. The local police department issued a statement saying they would conduct an internal review. But David wasn't convinced that anything meaningful would come of it. Behind closed doors, tensions were running high. David met with Chief Anthony Reed, the head of the local police department, to discuss the incident and the broader issue of police reform. "Chief, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," David began, his tone measured but firm. "But I'm going to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of faith in an internal review. We need an independent investigation, and we need real accountability." Chief Reed leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Judge Harris, I understand your concerns, and I agree that we need to take this seriously. But I also need you to understand that this isn't just about one officer. We have good people in this department, officers who follow the law and do their jobs with integrity." David nodded. "I'm not saying all officers are bad, Chief, but we both know that the system has flaws, and if we don't address those flaws, we're going to keep seeing incidents like what happened to me." Reed sighed, rubbing his temples as he considered David's words. "What do you want, David? What are you asking for?" David leaned forward, his voice firm. "I want transparency. I want accountability. And I want to see real, concrete changes in the way your officers are trained and held accountable for their actions. This can't be brushed under the rug." Reed stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll see what I can do. But you have to understand, change takes time, and it's not going to be easy." David nodded in return. "I understand, but we don't have the luxury of waiting any longer. Too many people are being hurt by a system that's supposed to protect them." As the investigation into the traffic stop began, the town became increasingly divided. On one side were the people who supported David and the push for police reform. They saw his encounter with Officer Daniels as a clear example of racial profiling, and they were demanding change. Rallies were held, with community members holding signs that read, "Justice for Judge Harris," and "End Racial Profiling Now." On the other side were those who believed that Officer Daniels had simply been doing his job. They argued that David was blowing the situation out of proportion, using his position to push a political agenda. Some in the law enforcement community felt that Daniels was being unfairly targeted, and that the scrutiny he faced was unwarranted. The tension in the town was palpable. Friends and neighbors who had once lived in harmony now found themselves on opposite sides of the debate, and the sense of unity that had once defined the community was quickly unraveling. One evening, as David walked through the downtown area, he overheard a conversation between two men standing outside a coffee shop. "Did you hear about Judge Harris?" one of the men asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "He's trying to turn the whole town against the police." The other man nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, I heard. It's a shame. Daniels is a good cop. He didn't deserve this." David kept walking, his jaw tight as he listened to their words. He had always known that speaking out would come with consequences, but hearing the backlash firsthand stung in a way he hadn't expected. Later that night, David sat with Eva on the back porch, the cool night air offering a brief respite from the chaos that had consumed their lives. He stared up at the stars, his mind racing with thoughts of the town, the people, the movement he had unwittingly sparked. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Eva asked softly, breaking the silence. David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we can't stay silent. Not when there's so much at stake." Eva nodded, her hand resting on his. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. We'll get through this together." The investigation into Officer Daniels' actions dragged on for weeks, with little progress. David had hoped that the public outcry would spur swift action, but instead it seemed to stall at every turn. The police department's internal review was slow and opaque, and the lack of transparency only fueled the anger and frustration of the community. David found himself at a breaking point. He had spent years working within the system, believing that it could be reformed from the inside. But now, after everything that had happened, he was beginning to question whether that was possible. One evening, David received a call from Marcus. His friend's voice was filled with urgency. "David, I just got word from someone on the inside. The investigation isn't going anywhere. They're dragging their feet, hoping this will blow over." David's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed left him feeling hollow. "So, what do we do now?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. Marcus paused for a moment before replying. We take it to the next level. We go public. We demand an independent investigation, and we push for real reforms. David was silent for a long time, weighing Marcus's words. He knew that going public would mean taking on the full force of the system, but at this point, what choice did he have? Okay, David said finally, his voice resolute. Let's do it. The press conference was larger than David had anticipated. News outlets from across the state gathered outside the courthouse, their cameras set up in neat rows, waiting for him to make a statement. Word had spread quickly about David's demand for an independent investigation, and the public's interest in the case had only grown. People wanted answers. David stood at the podium, his heart racing as he looked out over the crowd. Behind him stood his closest allies, Marcus Jacobs, Rachel Matthews, and several prominent civil rights leaders who had joined the fight. The support was overwhelming, but it didn't make this any easier. David had spent his entire career believing in the system, working within its boundaries. Now, he was standing on the outside, pushing against it. He took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium as he began to speak. Thank you all for being here today, David said, his voice strong and steady. I'm here because I believe in justice. I've dedicated my career to upholding the law and ensuring that every person who comes into my courtroom is treated with fairness and respect. But last month, something happened to me that shook my faith in the very system I've spent my life working within. The crowd was silent, listening intently as David continued. I was pulled over by an officer who didn't believe I was a judge, who questioned my right to be where I was, and who treated me like a criminal without cause. This is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of racial profiling and systemic injustice that affects people of color across this country. David's voice grew firmer as he spoke, the passion in his words resonating with the crowd. We've asked for an internal investigation, but weeks have passed, and there has been no progress. This lack of transparency, this unwillingness to hold officers accountable, it's unacceptable. That's why today, I'm calling for an independent investigation into this incident. We need real accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who has been affected by these issues. As David spoke, the cameras flashed, capturing every word. He knew the weight of what he was saying. He was challenging not just the local police department, but the entire system, a system that was resistant to change. We cannot allow this to continue, David said, his voice rising. We cannot allow people to be treated as though their rights don't matter. This is a fight for justice, for fairness, and for accountability. And I'm not going to stop until we see real, meaningful change. When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Reporters shouted questions, but David didn't stick around to answer them. He stepped back from the podium, his heart still pounding as he walked away from the cameras. Marcus was waiting for him at the edge of the crowd, his expression serious but supportive. You did good, David. Real good. David nodded, though the weight of what he had just done still hung over him. Let's hope it's enough, he said quietly. In the days following the press conference, the town became the epicenter of a national conversation about racial profiling and police reform. David's story had struck a chord with people all over the country, and rallies began popping up in cities across the nation. Signs with slogans like "Justice for Judge Harris" and "End Racial Profiling" were carried by activists who saw David's fight as part of a larger movement. The support was overwhelming, but it also came with new challenges. As the public rallied behind David, the pushback from law enforcement and conservative groups intensified. The local police union issued a statement defending Officer Daniels, claiming that the stop had been routine and that any accusations of misconduct were unfounded. Some media outlets picked up the union's narrative, framing David's actions as part of a political agenda rather than a fight for justice. David found himself caught in the middle of a storm, with supporters on one side and critics on the other. The tension in the town was palpable, and it wasn't long before it spilled over into public protests. One afternoon, as David was leaving the courthouse, he encountered a group of protesters gathered on the courthouse steps. Half of them were holding signs that read, "Support Judge Harris," while the other half carried signs in support of Officer Daniels. The two groups shouted at each other, their voices clashing in a chaotic mix of anger and frustration. David watched from a distance, his heart sinking as he realized how deeply divided the town had become. What had started as a fight for justice was now tearing the community apart. Rachel Matthews, who had been one of the key organizers of the protests in support of David, approached him, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "Judge Harris, we're with you," she said, her voice steady. "But things are getting heated. We've got to be careful. We don't want this to escalate into violence." David nodded, understanding her concern. "I know, Rachel. The last thing we want is for anyone to get hurt." Rachel looked over at the opposing group of protesters, her brow furrowed. "It's just, people are angry, and I get it. But we have to keep this peaceful, or they'll use it against us." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're right. We have to stay focused on the bigger picture. This isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about changing the system." Rachel nodded, her resolve hardening. "We won't let them win. We'll keep fighting." Despite the growing tension, David's demand for an independent investigation was finally answered. The state attorney general's office announced that they would be conducting an external review of the traffic stop, looking into Officer Daniels' actions and whether they had violated any department policies. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give David hope. The investigation wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step in the right direction, a sign that the system could be held accountable, even if it took outside pressure to make it happen. But as the investigation began, David found himself facing new challenges. The police union had doubled down on its defense of Officer Daniels, launching a smear campaign against David in the media. They questioned his motives, accusing him of using his position to push a personal agenda and undermining the trust between law enforcement and the community. David tried to tune out the noise, but the attack stung. He had spent his entire career working within the system, trying to make it better. And now he was being painted as a villain by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. One evening, as David sat in his office going over the latest news reports, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hang in there. We're doing the right thing. Don't let them get to you." David smiled faintly at the message, grateful for the support. But even with Marcus's encouragement, the pressure was starting to take its toll. Later that night, as David sat at the dinner table with Eva and the kids, he found it hard to focus. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the investigation, the protests, and the backlash. He had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his work and his personal life. But now, the lines between the two were blurring. Eva noticed his distraction and reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "David," she said softly, "you're carrying too much. You need to take a break." David shook his head, his jaw tight. "I can't, Eva. Not now. Not when we're so close." Eva squeezed his hand, her voice filled with concern. "I know how important this is to you, but you can't do it all by yourself. Let people help you." David sighed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of everything pressed down on him. I don't know how to stop. If I stop, it feels like I'm giving up." "You're not giving up," Eva said gently. "You're pacing yourself. This fight isn't going to be won overnight. You need to take care of yourself if you're going to keep going." David nodded, though the knot of tension in his chest remained. He knew she was right, but the thought of stepping back, even for a moment, felt impossible. The backlash against David reached a new level when his family became the target of threats. One evening, as he returned home from the courthouse, he found an envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a letter filled with hateful language, accusing David of being a traitor and threatening his family if he didn't stop his fight for reform. David's hands shook as he read the letter, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. This was no longer just about him. His family was now in danger because of the stance he had taken. Eva found him standing on the porch, the letter clutched in his hand. Her face paled as she saw the look of fear in his eyes. "David, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. David handed her the letter, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to horror. "We need to call the police," she said immediately, her voice shaking with urgency. David nodded, though a part of him felt sick at the thought of involving the very system he was fighting against. But there was no choice. His family's safety came first. The local police arrived within the hour, taking the letter as evidence and promising to investigate. But David could tell that they weren't taking the threat as seriously as he had hoped. To them, it was just another letter, probably the work of some disgruntled individual blowing off steam. But to David, it was a reminder of how dangerous this fight had become. Later that night, as he sat in the living room with Eva, the weight of everything came crashing down on him. The fear, the anger, the frustration, it all felt too heavy to bear. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, his voice filled with guilt. "I never wanted to put you or the kids in danger." Eva looked at him, her eyes soft but determined. "David, this isn't your fault. You're doing the right thing, and we're in this together, no matter what." David leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes as he tried to push the fear aside. But even as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of his home, the knot of dread in his chest refused to loosen. As the weeks passed, the investigation into Officer Daniels began to uncover troubling details about the traffic stop. Witnesses came forward, including Officer Daniel Tyler, a young cop who had been present during the stop but had remained silent until now. In a surprising move, Tyler broke ranks and testified that Officer Daniels had indeed treated David unfairly during the stop, profiling him based on his race and assuming he didn't belong in the neighborhood where he had been pulled over. Tyler's testimony was a bombshell, providing the first piece of concrete evidence that the stop had been anything but routine. When the news broke, the tide began to turn in David's favor. The media, which had been somewhat divided in its coverage of the incident, now focused on the damning testimony. Public support for David swelled, and even some of his critics began to question the narrative that the stop had been justified. But Tyler's testimony also brought new risks. By speaking out against his fellow officer, Tyler had put himself in the crosshairs of the police union and his colleagues. He became the target of harassment and intimidation, and David felt a deep sense of responsibility for what the young officer was going through. One afternoon, David met with Tyler at a local diner, wanting to thank him for his bravery. "Officer Tyler," David said, extending his hand as Tyler sat down across from him, "I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done. I know it wasn't easy." Tyler shook his hand, his expression a mixture of determination and fear. "Judge Harris, I had to do it. What happened wasn't right, and I couldn't stay silent any longer." David nodded, his respect for the young officer growing. "I know the risks you've taken, and I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We'll make sure you're protected." Tyler nodded, though the strain of the past few weeks was evident in his tired eyes. "Thank you, Judge. I just hope it's enough to make a difference." With Tyler's testimony on record, the investigation into the traffic stop took on new urgency. Public pressure mounted, and the state attorney general's office announced that they would be expanding the scope of the investigation to look into other incidents involving Officer Daniels and potential patterns of misconduct within the department. It was a major victory for David and his allies, but it also marked a turning point in the fight. The stakes were higher than ever, and the backlash from law enforcement was growing more intense. The police union continued to defend Daniels, framing the investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt. And tensions within the department were at an all-time high. David knew that the fight was far from over. The investigation was still ongoing, and there was no guarantee that it would lead to the kind of systemic reforms he was pushing for. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. One evening, as David sat on the back porch with Eva, the cool breeze rustling the trees around them, he reflected on everything that had happened. "We're getting close," David said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I can feel it." Eva smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've done so much already, David. No matter what happens, you've made a difference." David nodded, though the weight of the fight still hung heavy on his shoulders. "But it's not enough yet. We need real, lasting change. And I won't stop until we get it." Eva squeezed his hand, her voice soft but steady. "I know, and I'll be with you every step of the way." The investigation into Officer Daniels reached its climax on a rainy afternoon in late October. The State Attorney General's office held a press conference to announce the findings of their review, and the entire town held its breath, waiting for the verdict. David sat in his office, watching the live stream on his computer, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would determine the future of the fight for justice. When the Attorney General took the podium, the room fell silent. After a thorough investigation into the traffic stop involving Judge David Harris and Officer Daniels, we have found that Officer Daniels violated department policies and engaged in racial profiling. We are recommending disciplinary action, including termination, and we will be conducting a broader review of the department's practices to ensure that this does not happen again. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't a complete victory. There was still so much work to be done, but it was a step in the right direction. The press conference continued, with the Attorney General outlining the steps that would be taken to address the systemic issues within the police department. But David's mind was already racing with thoughts of what came next. The fight wasn't over, but they had won an important battle. Later that night, David stood on the front porch of his home, watching as the rain fell softly against the pavement. He felt a strange sense of calm, like the storm that had been raging for so long was finally starting to subside. But even as he stood there, he knew that the real work was just beginning. David stood in front of the courthouse, the heavy clouds above threatening rain, though they had yet to release a single drop. The Attorney General's announcement that Officer Daniels had been found guilty of racial profiling and would face disciplinary action had been a watershed moment in David's fight. The town was buzzing with the news, and people across the country saw it as a step toward real accountability. But David knew the fight wasn't over. While the verdict was a victory, it wasn't enough. The systemic issues that had allowed officers like Daniels to act without consequence were still in place, and the road to meaningful reform was still long and uncertain. The press swarmed around him, microphones and cameras thrust in his face as reporters fired off questions. David answered them as best he could, careful to keep the focus on the broader need for reform rather than just celebrating Daniels' punishment. There was no time for victory laps. The real work was only beginning. "Judge Harris, how do you feel now that the investigation is over?" one reporter asked. David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm relieved that justice has been served in this case, but this isn't the end. Officer Daniels' actions were part of a larger issue within the system, and we need to address that issue if we're going to prevent incidents like this from happening again." Another reporter pushed forward. "Do you think this will lead to broader reforms within the department?" David nodded. "I hope so, but hope isn't enough. We need to keep pushing, to hold our leaders accountable, and to demand the kind of systemic changes that will ensure that every person, regardless of their race or background, is treated with fairness and respect." As the press conference ended and the cameras turned away, David allowed himself a moment to breathe. He had done what he set out to do: shine a light on the injustice that had taken place and ensure that those responsible were held accountable. But the weight of the journey still pressed down on him. There was so much more to be done. While David's supporters celebrated the outcome of the investigation, the town remained deeply divided. Those who had rallied behind Officer Daniels were outraged by the decision, claiming that Daniels had been scapegoated to appease political pressure. The police union, which had defended Daniels throughout the investigation, issued a statement condemning the Attorney General's findings and vowed to fight the decision. Protests erupted once again, but this time they were marked by even more tension. On one side were the activists who had fought for justice and accountability, celebrating the decision as a step toward real reform. On the other side were those who believed that Daniels had been unfairly targeted, their anger fueling calls for his reinstatement. David watched as the town he had grown up in became a battleground. Friends who had once shared peaceful dinners were now shouting at each other across the street, their relationships fractured by the deep divisions the case had exposed. It pained him to see the community torn apart. But he knew that this was the inevitable consequence of confronting a system that had been entrenched for so long. One evening, as David walked through the town square, he overheard a heated argument between two men who had once been close friends. "You think this is justice?" one man shouted. "Daniels was just doing his job. He didn't deserve this." "He was doing his job by profiling a black man?" the other man shot back. "You call that justice?" David felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had never wanted this fight to tear the community apart, but he knew that real change often came at a cost. As he passed by the group, one of the men spotted him and called out, "Judge Harris! What do you have to say about this? You happy now that the town's in chaos?" David stopped, turning to face the man. He could see the anger in his eyes, but he also saw something else. Fear. Fear of change. Fear of the unknown. Fear of a world where the rules were different. "I'm not happy about the division in this town," David said calmly. "But this fight was never about tearing us apart. It's about building something better, something fairer. And that's going to take time. But I believe we can get there if we work together." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, we'll see about that." David continued walking, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. He knew the road ahead was going to be rough, but he also knew that it was a road worth walking. In the weeks following the Attorney General's announcement, the movement for police reform gained momentum. David, Marcus, and Rachel Matthews continued to organize rallies and town hall meetings, gathering support from activists, community leaders, and even some politicians who were ready to take on the issue. At one such town hall meeting, David stood before a packed room of residents, activists, and local officials. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of hope, frustration, and determination. People were ready for change, and they were looking to David to help lead the way. "We can't stop now," David said, his voice steady but passionate. "This fight isn't over just because one officer was held accountable. We need to keep pushing for the kind of reforms that will prevent this from happening again." The crowd erupted into applause, and David felt a surge of energy. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but now he was fighting for something even bigger: systemic change that would impact generations to come. After the meeting, Rachel approached David, her expression a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "We're making progress," she said, her voice breathless. "People are listening. They're ready for this." David nodded, though the weight of the fight still pressed down on him. "It's going to take time, but you're right. We're getting there." Rachel smiled, her eyes shining with determination. "We won't stop until we've won." While the movement gained traction, David's personal life continued to bear the brunt of the fight. The threats against his family hadn't stopped, and the tension in his home was palpable. Ava tried to be strong, but David could see the strain it was putting on her. She had always been his rock, but even she had her limits. One night, as they sat on the couch together, Eva finally let the mask slip. "David, I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared for the kids. I'm scared for you." David wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I know," he said softly. "And I'm sorry. I never wanted to put you or the kids in danger." Eva wiped away a tear, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you're doing the right thing. I know that. But sometimes, I just want my husband back. I want our life back." David's heart ached as he listened to her words. He had known that this fight would come with sacrifices, but hearing Eva's pain made it all the more real. He didn't have the answers she needed, but he knew that he couldn't turn back now. "I'm almost there," David whispered. "I promise. Just a little longer." Ava nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "I'll be here," she said quietly. "But I need you to promise me something, David." "Anything," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Promise me that when this is over, you'll come back to us. You'll be here. Really here." David swallowed hard, nodding as he held her tighter. "I promise." As the fight for reform reached its climax, David and his allies prepared for the final push. The state legislature was set to vote on a comprehensive police reform bill, one that included measures to address racial profiling, increase accountability, and implement community oversight of law enforcement agencies. It was the culmination of months of work, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. David spent long hours meeting with lawmakers, trying to rally support for the bill. Marcus and Rachel worked tirelessly alongside him, organizing rallies and pushing the public to demand action from their representatives. The pressure was mounting, and the outcome of the vote was far from certain. The night before the vote, David found himself alone in his office, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. He had given everything to this fight, his time, his energy, even his personal safety. But now, on the eve of the most important vote of his life, doubt crept in. What if they didn't win? What if all of this had been for nothing? David leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as he tried to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He had come so far, but the weight of it all felt crushing. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and he opened his eyes to see Marcus standing in the doorway. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with concern. David nodded, though his heart was heavy. "Just thinking." Marcus stepped into the office, sitting down across from David. "You've done everything you can. Now it's in their hands." David sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know, but it's hard not to worry." Marcus smiled faintly. "We're going to win this, David. I can feel it." David hoped he was right. The day of the vote arrived, and the state legislature was packed with lawmakers, activists, and members of the public who had come to witness the moment. David sat in the gallery, his heart pounding in his chest as the roll call began. The votes trickled in, each one feeling like an eternity. Every yes brought a surge of hope, while every no felt like a punch to the gut. David clenched his fists, his knuckles white as he waited for the final tally. When the last vote was cast, there was a pause. Then, the Speaker of the House announced the results. "The police reform bill has passed." The room erupted into cheers, and David felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. After months of fighting, of sacrifice, of pushing against a system that had resisted change for so long, they had finally won. Marcus clapped David on the back, his face beaming with pride. "I told you we'd do it." David nodded, though the weight of the moment still pressed down on him. It wasn't just about this one victory. It was about the future they had fought to build. A future where justice and fairness weren't just ideals, but realities. In the weeks that followed the vote, the town began to heal. The passage of the police reform bill had been a turning point, not just for the state, but for the country. Other states began to follow suit, introducing similar measures to address racial profiling and police accountability. The movement David had helped ignite was spreading, and real change was finally taking root. But for David, the fight was personal. He had given so much of himself to this cause, and now, as the dust began to settle, he found himself longing for the peace he had once known. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Eva, watching the sun set over the horizon, he realized that he had kept his promise. He had fought for justice, and he had won. But now, it was time to come home. Eva leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. "You did it, David. You made a difference." David smiled, though there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And now it's time to move forward." Eva nodded, her hand resting in his. "We'll move forward together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months. The fight for justice wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future could be better. And for now, that was enough. The passage of the police reform bill had been a monumental victory, but the healing process in David's town was only just beginning. The division that had split the community was still present, though the tension had begun to ease in the weeks that followed. As people slowly came to terms with the changes, David found himself at the center of a new conversation, one focused on rebuilding trust and unity. David spent his days meeting with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and activists, working to bridge the gap that had formed between the police and the residents they were meant to serve. He knew that reform wasn't just about changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. One afternoon, David attended a community forum organized by a local church. where members of the police department and town residents gathered to discuss the future. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: black, white, young, old, each of them eager to find a way forward. "I know this has been a difficult time for our town," David began, standing at the front of the room. "But if we're going to heal, we need to start by listening to each other. We can't undo the past, but we can build a better future. And that starts with dialogue." The forum was tense at first, with residents voicing their frustrations and fears about the police. Some officers were defensive, struggling to accept the criticism being leveled against them. But as the evening wore on, something remarkable happened. People began to listen. Slowly, the walls between them started to come down. One young man, a local resident named Jamal, stood up and spoke about his experiences growing up in the town. "I've been stopped more times than I can count," Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because of the color of my skin. That needs to change." Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of the newer recruits in the department, responded to Jamal's concerns. "I hear you," she said, her voice soft but sincere, "and I want you to know that we're committed to doing better. This isn't just about following orders, it's about making sure everyone feels safe and respected." The exchange was a small but important step toward rebuilding trust, and by the end of the night, there was a sense of hope in the room. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but the conversation had begun. As David left the forum, Rachel Matthews caught up with him, her eyes bright with optimism. "That was incredible," she said. "You're really making a difference." David smiled, though his expression remained thoughtful. "We're all making a difference. But this is just the beginning." As part of the police reform bill, new guidelines were implemented for training and accountability within the police department. Officers were required to undergo additional training on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. An independent oversight board was established to investigate any future complaints of misconduct, ensuring that there would be transparency and accountability moving forward. For many officers, the changes were a welcome shift. Sarah Mitchell, the young officer who had spoken at the forum, became a key advocate for the new training protocols. She believed in the potential for positive change and took it upon herself to mentor other officers, helping them navigate the new expectations and embrace a more community-centered approach to policing. But not everyone in the department welcomed the changes. There were pockets of resistance, with some officers feeling that the new policies were too restrictive or that they unfairly targeted law enforcement. The police union, still stung by the outcome of the Daniels case, continued to push back, though their influence was waning. One day, David met with Chief Anthony Reed, the head of the department, to discuss how things were progressing. The chief had been reluctant to embrace the reforms at first, but over time, he had come to see their value. "Judge Harris," Reed said, shaking David's hand as he entered the office, "I have to admit, I didn't think we'd get here. But the changes? They're making a difference." David sat down across from him, nodding. "That's good to hear, Chief. I know this hasn't been easy for anyone, but we're seeing progress. That's what matters." Reed leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We still have a lot of work to do. There are officers who aren't happy with the new rules. But I've seen how the community is responding. They're starting to trust us again. And that's worth everything." David smiled, feeling a sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. "Change is hard, but we're on the right path." Reed nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. "Thanks to you, Judge? You've been the driving force behind all of this." David shook his head. "It's not just me. It's everyone who stood up and said, 'Enough is enough.' We couldn't have done this alone." As David's professional life began to stabilize, he turned his attention back to his family. The toll the past year had taken on Eva and the kids was undeniable. They had faced threats, fear, and uncertainty, and David knew that he needed to make things right at home. One Saturday morning, as the kids played in the backyard and Eva worked in the garden, David approached her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had been absent, physically and emotionally, for far too long. "Eva," he began, kneeling beside her as she tended to her plants, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I want to apologize. Ava looked up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. Apologize? For what? For not being here, David said quietly. For putting so much into the fight that I lost sight of what really matters. You and the kids. I promised you I'd be present, and I haven't been. Ava's expression softened, and she placed her hand on his. David, you were fighting for something bigger than all of us. I knew that, and I was with you every step of the way. David sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. But I could have done more. I could have been more here for you. Ava squeezed his hand, her voice gentle but firm. You did what you had to do, and now we have a chance to move forward. Together. David looked up at her, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. I'm here now, he said, his voice filled with emotion. And I'm not going anywhere. Ava smiled, pulling him into a tight embrace. That's all I need. Months passed, and the reforms that had been implemented in the police department began to take hold. The town, once fractured by division, slowly began to heal. People who had been on opposite sides of the debate started to find common ground, and the conversation shifted from conflict to collaboration. David became a mentor to younger judges and attorneys, sharing his experiences and helping them navigate the challenges of working within a system that was still evolving. He was invited to speak at universities and legal conferences, where he shared his story and encouraged others to continue the fight for justice and reform. One day, Marcus Jacobs stopped by David's office, a wide grin on his face. David, you're not going to believe this, he said, holding up a letter. David raised an eyebrow, curious. What is it? Marcus handed him the letter, and as David read it, a smile spread across his face. It was an invitation from the governor, asking David to serve on a state task force focused on police reform and racial justice. This is huge, Marcus said, his voice filled with excitement. You'll be shaping policy at the highest level. David leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of pride and humility. It's an honor, he said, but it's also a big responsibility. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. You've been handling responsibility your whole life, David. You've got this. David nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't over, but now he had the opportunity to make an even bigger impact, to help shape the future of law enforcement and ensure that the changes he had fought for would last. On the anniversary of the traffic stop that had changed his life, David found himself standing on the side of the road where it had all begun. The spot looked different now, quieter, more peaceful. The tension that had filled the air that night was long gone, replaced by a sense of calm. David stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past year. The battles he had fought, the victories he had won, and the people he had met along the way. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. He thought of Officer Daniels, who had been quietly dismissed from the force after the investigation. It wasn't something David celebrated. Daniels had been a product of a broken system, and David's fight had always been about fixing that system. Not punishing individuals, but justice had been served, and that was what mattered. As David stood there, a car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and Jamal, the young man who had spoken at the community forum, leaned out. Judge Harris, Jamal called, smiling. What are you doing out here? David smiled back. Just thinking. Jamal nodded, his expression thoughtful. A lot's changed since that night. David nodded, his heart full. Yeah, it has. As David walked back to his car, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The fight for justice and reform was ongoing, but the foundations had been laid. The town was healing, his family was stronger than ever, and the movement he had helped build was growing every day. When David returned home, Ava was waiting for him on the porch, her eyes soft with love and understanding. How was your day? She asked, her voice gentle. David smiled, sitting down beside her. It was good, really good. Ava leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the horizon. For the first time in a long time, David felt hopeful. The road ahead was still long, but he wasn't walking it alone. And that, more than anything, gave him the strength to keep going. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, David thought about the future, about the legacy he was leaving behind for his children, for his community, and for everyone who believed in the power of justice. This was just the beginning. As David looked out at the world he had fought to change, he knew the journey wasn't over. There were more battles to be fought, more voices to be heard, and more lives to impact. But together, change was possible. Justice was possible. Hop! If you've been moved by David's story and want to be a part of the ongoing conversation about justice, equality, and reform, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Stay informed, stay engaged, and let's continue fighting for a better future together. Subscribe now and join the movement for change.